I watched them lower my husband into the earth, and I felt nothing but the sweet, forbidden weight of relief. 5 years of silence, 5 years of cold hands and colder words, and now I stood in black silk beside an open grave, wondering if the tears on my cheeks were grief or gratitude. The morning of Lord Marcus Ashworth's funeral dawned gray and unforgiving, as if the sky itself had dressed in mourning. Thornwood Hall loomed behind me, its stone facade the color of old bones, its windows watching like hollow eyes. The estate had stood for 300 years, witness to births and deaths and secrets beyond counting, and now it would witness one more ending. Or so I believed. I had lived within those walls for 5 years, and I had never once felt at home. The corridors stretched endless and cold, lined with portraits of Ashworth ancestors who seemed to follow my movements with disapproving gazes. The rooms were vast and silent, filled with furniture that had been chosen by hands long dead, decorated according to tastes I did not share. Even my own chambers felt borrowed, temporary, as if I were a guest who had overstayed her welcome. I had been 19 when my father brought me to this place, 19 and desperate, my family's debts pressing against my throat like a noose. We had once been comfortable, even prosperous, but my father's gambling and my mother's illness had consumed everything. The house in Surrey had been sold, the servants had been dismissed. We had been reduced to living in a cramped set of rooms in an unfashionable part of London, surviving on the charity of distant relatives who made their resentment clear with every meal they provided. And then Lord Marcus Ashworth had appeared, like an answer to prayers I had never dared to utter. He was a business associate of my uncle, a widower of considerable wealth and even more considerable connections. He had come to dinner one evening, and he had noticed me, and within a fortnight he had made his intentions known. He wanted a wife, a young wife from a good family, who would grace his table and bear his children and restore some warmth to the cold halls of Thornwood. My father had been overjoyed. My mother, weak with illness, had wept with relief. And I had stood in the drawing-room of my uncle's house, looking at this man who was old enough to be my father, and I had said yes. What other choice did I have? To refuse would mean condemning my family to penury and disgrace. To accept meant security, comfort, a future. It was not love. It was survival. Lord Marcus had been 43, a man of medium height and medium coloring, with pale blue eyes that seemed to look through rather than at me. He was not unkind in those early days. He was simply distant, as if I were a painting he had purchased for his gallery, a decorative addition to his household rather than a living, breathing woman. He had looked at me the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he intends to buy, assessing my value, calculating my worth. And I had let him. I had smiled and curtsied and accepted his proposal because the alternative was unthinkable. The guests had gathered in the chapel on the estate grounds, a small stone building with stained glass windows that threw colored shadows across the pews. The chapel had been built by Marcus's great-grandfather, a man of considerable piety, and every Ashworth since had been baptized, married, and buried within its walls. The air smelled of incense and old stone and the cloying sweetness of lilies, those funeral flowers that seemed to be everywhere, their white petals like tears frozen in time. I recognized most of the guests, the familiar faces of society, the lords and ladies who had once welcomed me into their drawing rooms and now regarded me with a mixture of pity and suspicion. They whispered behind their fans and their gloved hands, their voices soft but their meaning clear. The young Lady Ashworth, such a tragedy, so young to be a widow. And yet, have you heard the rumors? The way she looked at that doctor. Lady Pemberton sat in the front row, her black crape rustling as she shifted, her eyes sharp beneath her veil. She had never liked me. She had been a friend of Marcus's first wife, and she had made it clear from the beginning that I was an interloper, a replacement who could never measure up to the sainted memory of Cecilia Ashworth. At every dinner party, every ball, every afternoon tea, She had found ways to remind me of my inadequacy. The way she decorated the music room, the flowers she chose for the entrance hall, the charities she supported. Always Cecilia. Always the perfect first wife, preserved forever in memory, unchangeable and unchallengeable in her perfection. I kept my gaze fixed on the coffin, that long mahogany box with its brass fittings and its spray of white lilies. The wood gleamed in the candlelight, polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the dancing flames of the tapers that surrounded it. Inside lay the man who had been my husband, the man who had shared my bed without ever sharing my heart. I tried to summon some feeling for him, some flicker of sorrow or regret, but there was nothing, only emptiness, only the quiet hum of anticipation that I tried desperately to suppress. The truth is, Marcus and I had lived as strangers for years. After the first few months of marriage, when the novelty of a young bride had worn thin, he had retreated into his own world. He spent his days in his study or his private chambers, emerging only for meals and the occasional social obligation. He never asked about my day or inquired after my interests. He never noticed when I was sad or celebrated when I was happy. He used my body for his own pleasure, coming to my chambers late at night with the predictability of a clockwork mechanism, and then departing without a word of tenderness or affection. I was not a wife to him. I was a function, a role to be filled, a vessel for heirs that never came. The absence of children had been my greatest sorrow and my greatest relief. I had longed for a baby, someone to love and be loved by, someone who would need me in a way that Marcus never did. But month after month, year after year, my body refused to cooperate. The doctors spoke of time and patience, of rest and tonics and special diets. Marcus spoke of disappointment and failure, his pale eyes growing colder with each passing season. And I had wept alone in my chambers, mourning the children I would never hold. But now, standing beside his coffin, I felt almost grateful for that empty womb. A child would have bound me to Marcus forever, to his name and his legacy and his cold, dead house. Without children, I was free. Free to leave Thornwood Hall and never return. Free to build a new life, a life of my own choosing. Free to be with Julian. Julian stood at the back of the chapel near the doors. I did not turn to look at him, but I felt his presence like heat against my skin. He was watching me, I knew. His dark eyes would be fixed on the curve of my neck, the set of my shoulders, searching for signs of grief that we both knew I did not feel. Dr. Julian Hale, the physician who had come to Thornwood Hall 3 months ago to treat my husband's mysterious illness, the man who had awakened something in me that I had believed long dead. The man I loved with a ferocity that terrified me. It had begun so innocently. Marcus had been ill for weeks, complaining of fatigue and headaches, of a strange numbness in his hands and feet. At first, I had dismissed his complaints as the imaginings of a man too accustomed to his own company. But as the days passed, his condition worsened. He grew pale and thin, unable to eat, unable to sleep, plagued by pains that seemed to have no physical cause. The local doctor, old Dr. Whitmore, had been baffled. He prescribed rest and fortifying tonics, but nothing helped. And so Marcus had summoned a specialist from London, a young physician who had made a name for himself treating difficult cases. Julian had arrived on a rainy afternoon in October, his coat dripping, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. The butler had shown him into the drawing room where I sat by the fire, and he had apologized for his appearance, for the state of his boots, for the water dripping onto the Persian carpet. He was flustered and awkward and entirely unlike the polished gentleman I had grown accustomed to, and I had found myself smiling, truly smiling, for the first time in months. He was nothing like Marcus. Where my husband was cold and distant, Julian was warm and attentive. Where Marcus spoke to me as if I were a servant or a child, Julian listened to my opinions and valued my thoughts. He had gentle hands and kind eyes, the color of strong tea, and when he looked at me, I felt seen in a way I had never felt before. It was as if he could perceive something beneath my carefully constructed exterior. Some spark of the woman I had been before marriage had extinguished my flame. We talked for hours in the library while Marcus slept, about books and music and philosophy, about our hopes and dreams and fears. Julian told me of his training in Edinburgh, of the professors who had inspired him and the patients who had humbled him. He spoke of his desire to ease suffering, to bring comfort to those in pain, to advance the boundaries of medical knowledge. And I, who had not spoken of such things to anyone in years, found myself confessing my own loneliness, my own disappointments, my own thwarted dreams of a life that had meaning beyond the walls of Thornwood Hall. The attraction between us was undeniable, a physical force that seemed to bend the very air. I would catch him watching me across the dinner table, his eyes dark with longing, and I would feel my heart leap in my chest. He would brush against me as he passed in the corridor, the lightest of touches, and my skin would burn where he had been. We were drawn together like moths to a flame, unable to resist the pull of something greater than ourselves. And slowly, inevitably, we fell in love. I knew it was wrong. I knew that I was a married woman, that I had made vows before God and society. I knew that if we were discovered, the scandal would destroy us both. But those vows had been made under duress, made to a man who had never loved me, who had only wanted a young wife to display like a trophy. Marcus had never been cruel, not exactly, but he had been indifferent, and sometimes indifference is its own kind of cruelty. He had never asked about my day or noticed when I was sad. He had never held me in the night or whispered words of comfort. He had used my body for his own pleasure, and then turned away, leaving me alone in the darkness with only my thoughts for company. Julian had offered me something different. Julian had offered me tenderness and passion and the intoxicating sensation of being truly known. We had stolen moments together, brief touches and whispered conversations, always careful, always cautious. We had never consummated our love, not fully, but we had come close. There had been kisses in the conservatory, desperate and hungry, our bodies pressed together in the green-scented darkness while the rain drummed against the glass. There had been embraces in the garden, hidden by the hedges from prying eyes, our hearts beating in sync as the world fell away. And there had been promises, spoken softly in the shadows, promises of a future together once Marcus was gone. I had not wished for my husband's death. I want to be clear about that. I had not prayed for it, or plotted it, or hoped for it. But when Julian told me that Marcus's condition was terminal, that his body was failing in ways that medicine could not explain, I had felt a terrible, shameful surge of hope. I had imagined what my life might be like once I was free. I had imagined marrying Julian, living with him in some quiet cottage far from society's watchful eyes. I had imagined being happy. And then Marcus had died, and I had allowed myself to believe that my dreams might come true. The death had come at midnight, as deaths so often do. I had been summoned to his chambers by the frantic ringing of the bell, and I had found Julian already there, his face grave. His fingers pressed to Marcus's wrist. "There is nothing more I can do," he had said, and his voice had been steady, professional, but his eyes, when they met mine, had been full of meaning. We had stood together beside the bed, watching as the last breath rattled from my husband's lungs, watching as his pale eyes clouded and fixed, staring at something none of us could see. "He is gone," Julian had said, and he had closed Marcus's eyes with gentle fingers, and I had felt the world shift beneath my feet. The days between death and burial had passed in a blur of black crepe and hushed voices. The undertakers had come to prepare the body. The vicar had come to discuss the service. Letters had been sent, arrangements made, mourning clothes ordered. I had moved through it all as if in a dream, performing the duties expected of a grieving widow while my heart sang with secret joy. Soon it would be over. Soon I would be free. The vicar was speaking now, his voice droning on about resurrection and eternal life. The words washed over me, meaningless sounds, as I bowed my head and tried to look appropriately mournful. Beside me, my mother-in-law sat rigid and silent, her face hidden behind her veil. The Dowager Countess of Thornwood had never approved of me, but she had tolerated my presence for the sake of her son. She was a formidable woman, tall and thin as a blade, with iron-gray hair and eyes like chips of flint. She had ruled Thornwood Hall for 40 years before my arrival, and she had never truly relinquished her control. Every decision I made, every change I suggested, was met with a raised eyebrow and a pointed reminder of how things had always been done. She was the true mistress of this house. I was merely a temporary custodian. Now that Marcus was gone, I suspected she would be eager to see me leave. The thought did not trouble me. I had no desire to remain at Thornwood Hall, no attachment to its cold rooms and drafty corridors. Let her have it. Let her rattle around in its emptiness with her memories and her bitterness. I would be far away, building a new life with the man I loved. The service drew to a close, and the pallbearers stepped forward to carry the coffin to the grave. I watched them lift it, their faces solemn, their movements practiced. There were 6 of them, tenants and servants who had known Marcus all their lives, men who bore the weight of their Lord with the same stolid acceptance they brought to every burden. Outside, the sky had darkened further, and I could smell rain on the wind, that sharp metallic scent that always preceded a storm. We processed out of the chapel in a long black line, our footsteps crunching on the gravel path that led to the family cemetery. The cemetery lay on a small hill behind the chapel, surrounded by an iron fence that had long since rusted to the color of dried blood. Ancient yew trees stood sentinel at each corner, their branches dark and heavy with age. The oldest graves dated back centuries, their stones worn smooth by time and weather, their inscriptions faded to illegibility. The newer graves, those of the more recent Ashworths, were marked by elaborate monuments of marble and granite, angels and urns and weeping willows carved in eternal mourning. The grave had been dug beside the tomb of Cecilia, Marcus's first wife. A great marble slab marked her resting place, carved with her name and the dates of her birth and death. Beloved wife of Marcus, Lord Ashworth. Taken too soon. I wondered if he had requested this placement, if he had wanted to spend eternity next to the woman he had truly loved. It seemed fitting somehow. They could keep each other company in death, and I would be free to find my own happiness among the living. The coffin was placed on the wooden slats above the grave, and the vicar began the final prayers. I stood at the edge, my hands clasped before me, my eyes fixed on the polished wood. Around me, I could hear the quiet weeping of the mourners, the rustle of fabric, the distant cry of a crow. The wind picked up, tugging at my veil, and I shivered despite the thickness of my mourning gown. The black silk was heavy against my skin, suffocating, as if I were being slowly wrapped in darkness. It was then that the tradition of the viewing began. In our family, as in many aristocratic families of the time, it was customary to open the coffin one last time before burial, to allow the mourners a final glimpse of the deceased. I had always found the practice morbid, this insistence on confronting death in its most physical form, but Marcus had been particular about such things, and his mother had insisted that we honor the tradition. The undertaker stepped forward, a thin man in a black coat who moved with the practiced efficiency of someone long accustomed to the rituals of death. He unfastened the brass clasps one by one, the metallic clicks loud in the silence. I held my breath as he lifted the lid, revealing the pale, waxy features of my husband. Marcus looked smaller in death, diminished somehow, as if the life that had animated him had been the only thing giving him substance. His hands were folded across his chest, and someone had placed a white rose between his fingers. His eyes were closed, His lips slightly parted, and for a moment I felt a flicker of something that might have been sorrow. He had been a man, after all. He had lived and breathed and felt. He had loved Cecilia in his way, and perhaps he had even tried to love me. And now he was gone, and whatever chance we might have had to understand each other was gone with him. The mourners filed past the coffin, each of them pausing to pay their respects. Lady Pemberton pressed a handkerchief to her lips and turned away with a sob that seemed, to my uncharitable ears, somewhat theatrical. Sir Edmund Blackwood, Marcus's oldest friend, stood motionless for a long moment, his weathered face unreadable. The Dowager Countess approached last, her movements slow and deliberate, and I saw her lips move in what might have been a prayer or a final farewell. I waited my turn, dreading the moment when I would have to look upon my husband's face one final time. The line shuffled forward, and I moved with it, my legs carrying me closer to the coffin despite my reluctance. I could smell the flowers now, the heavy sweetness of the lilies, and beneath it, something else, something cold and wrong. And then it happened. I was standing directly beside the coffin, my gaze fixed on Marcus's peaceful features, when his eyes opened. I cannot describe the horror of that moment, the utter wrongness of seeing life where there should have been none. One moment his face was still, the slack mask of death, and the next his eyelids were lifting, slowly, tremblingly, revealing the pale blue irises beneath. His eyes were the same color they had always been, but there was something different in them now, something wild and desperate and terrifyingly alive. They darted from side to side, unfocused, searching, and then they fixed on me with an intensity that made my blood freeze. His lips moved, forming words that I could not hear, soundless shapes that might have been my name. And then his hand rose from his chest, slowly, tremblingly, the white rose falling from his fingers to land soundlessly on the silk lining of the coffin. His arm extended, his finger pointed, straight as an arrow, past me, past the mourners, toward the back of the chapel grounds. At Julian. The screams began almost immediately. Lady Pemberton fainted, collapsing into the arms of her husband with a dramatic swoon. Sir Edmund stumbled backward, his face gone white as chalk. The Dowager Countess let out a sound I had never heard before, a high keen of terror that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her. All around me, chaos erupted, voices shouting, bodies pushing, the orderly mourning giving way to primal terror. But I could not move. I stood frozen beside the coffin, my eyes locked on my husband's accusing finger, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. This was impossible. This could not be happening. I had seen Marcus die. I had watched the breath leave his body, had felt the coldness of his skin. He had been dead for 3 days. He had been embalmed. He was in a coffin. And yet he was moving. He was alive. Marcus's mouth was still working, and now I could hear the words, rasping and broken, forced from lungs that should not have held breath. His voice was terrible, a croak from beyond the grave, but the words were clear enough for everyone to hear. Murderer. He tried to kill me. He poisoned me. I looked at Julian, and I saw the color drain from his face. He stood motionless at the back of the gathering, his eyes wide, his hands raised as if to ward off a blow. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like a man who had seen his own death sentence written in the sky. And then the men were upon him, the lords and gentlemen who had come to pay their respects, their faces twisted with righteous fury. They seized him by the arms and dragged him forward, ignoring his protests, his pleas of innocence. Someone was shouting for the constable. Someone else was demanding ropes, chains, anything to bind the murderer. I did nothing. I said nothing. I stood beside my husband's coffin, my mind reeling, my world crumbling around me, and I did not speak a single word in Julian's defense. Even as they dragged him past me, even as his eyes met mine with desperate pleading, I remained silent, frozen, mute as the grave that had just refused to hold my husband. What could I have said? What words could I have found to defend the man I loved against the accusation of a man risen from the dead? Society had witnessed what I had witnessed. They had seen Marcus point. They had heard him speak. And they had drawn the obvious conclusion. Julian Hale was a murderer, and I, his lover, was his accomplice. The constables arrived within the hour. Someone had sent for them, I never learned who, and they came in a black carriage with barred windows, their faces grim beneath their tall hats. They took Julian away in chains, his wrists bound with iron shackles, his head bowed as if the weight of the accusation had already broken him. He looked at me as they led him past, his eyes searching my face for something, hope or reassurance, or simply understanding. But I could not meet his gaze. I could not bear to see the question that burned beneath his desperate expression. Did you know? Did you suspect? Did you betray me? I had no answers. I had only confusion and fear, and the terrible dawning suspicion that everything I had believed was a lie. The days that followed were a blur of whispers and accusations. The scandal spread through society like wildfire, consuming everything in its path. The story was too delicious to resist. A young wife, a handsome doctor, a husband risen from the dead to accuse his own murderer. The newspapers printed breathless accounts, embellishing the details, inventing conversations and motives that had never existed. The Gazette ran a full-page illustration of the scene at the funeral, rendered in dramatic black ink, showing Marcus pointing from his coffin while mourners fled in terror. The Times published interviews with servants and neighbors, each of them eager to add their own observations to the growing narrative of scandal. The young Lady Ashworth had been seen walking in the garden with Dr. Hale. The young Lady Ashworth had dismissed her lady's maid one evening and received the doctor alone in her sitting room. The young Lady Ashworth had smiled at her husband's funeral, had shown insufficient grief, had worn a ribbon of pale blue beneath her mourning black. Every detail was scrutinized, every action reinterpreted in light of the new revelation. I was painted as a scarlet woman, a faithless wife who had conspired with her lover to murder her husband. Julian was portrayed as a scheming villain, a man who had used his medical knowledge to poison an innocent man. The fact that Marcus was still alive, that he had made a miraculous recovery, only added to the sensation. He was a victim twice over, they said. Betrayed by his wife and his physician, condemned to die by poison, saved only by some miracle of constitution or providence. No one cared about the truth. No one asked what had really happened. They had their story, and they clung to it with the fervor of religious conviction. I retreated to Thornwood Hall, unable to face the pointing fingers and cutting whispers. The servants looked at me differently now, their deference tinged with suspicion and contempt. The cook, who had always prepared my favorite dishes without being asked, now served me cold meat and stale bread. The housemaids, who had once bobbed curtsies and called me my lady with genuine respect, now muttered under their breath and found excuses to avoid my presence. Even my own lady's maid, a girl named Rose I had trusted for years, seemed to recoil from my presence, her eyes sliding away whenever I tried to meet them. I ate alone in my rooms, the food tasteless in my mouth, and I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of the nightmare my life had become. The shadows on the walls shifted and danced, forming shapes that might have been faces, might have been accusations. I heard footsteps in the corridor outside my door, slow and deliberate, and I wondered if Marcus had sent someone to watch me, to ensure I did not flee, to ensure I remained trapped in this house until he decided what to do with me. Marcus was alive. That was the one undeniable fact amid the chaos of speculation and accusation. He had been revived somehow from what everyone had believed was death. The doctors could not explain it. They spoke of catalepsy, of rare conditions that mimicked death so perfectly that even experienced physicians could be fooled. They spoke of the case of Lady Emma Featherstone, who had awakened at her own funeral 30 years ago, and the case of William Brooks, who had clawed his way out of his own grave after being buried alive. Such things happened, they said. Rarely, but they happened. But I had seen the pallor of Marcus's skin, had felt the coldness of his hands. I had watched Julian examine him, had heard him pronounce the death with the certainty of a man trained to recognize the difference between life and its absence. I had been certain that Marcus was dead. Julian had been certain. The undertaker, with decades of experience handling corpses, had been certain. And yet Marcus lived. And now he lay in his chambers, attended by a new team of doctors, slowly recovering his strength. I had not been permitted to see him. The Dowager Countess had forbidden it, claiming that my presence would upset her son, that the shock of seeing me might cause a relapse. She had posted servants outside his door with instructions to turn me away if I approached. She had made it clear, without ever stating it directly, that she believed me guilty, that she would see me punished for what I had supposedly done to her son. I suspected the truth was simpler. She had always wanted me gone, and now she had her excuse. But I had not tried to kill Marcus. I had not poisoned him, or harmed him, or wished him dead. I had only loved another man, and that love, however forbidden, was not a crime. Was it? I began to question everything. I replayed every moment of the past 3 months in my mind, searching for clues, for signs that I had missed. Julian had been treating Marcus's illness, had been giving him medicines and tonics and powders. He had assured me that he was doing everything possible to save my husband's life. He had explained the treatments to me, had shown me the bottles and the prescriptions, had seemed utterly committed to Marcus's recovery. But what if that had been a lie? What if Julian had been poisoning Marcus all along, slowly weakening him, preparing him for death? What if the medicines that were supposed to heal had been designed to kill? The thought made me sick with horror. I had trusted Julian completely. I had believed in his goodness, his integrity, his love for me. But what did I really know about him? He had come into my life so suddenly, had swept me off my feet with his charm and his attentiveness. Had it all been a performance? Had he been playing a role, seducing me for his own purposes? I did not want to believe it. Every fiber of my being rebelled against the possibility. Julian had been kind and gentle and passionate. He had held me in his arms and whispered words of love. He had looked at me with such tenderness that I had felt my heart might break from the beauty of it. That could not have been false. That could not have been a lie. But the doubts persisted, gnawing at my certainty, eroding my faith. I had been wrong before. I had misjudged Marcus, had believed that I could learn to love him, that our marriage might grow into something meaningful. I had been naive and foolish, and I had paid the price in years of loneliness and despair. What if I had been equally naive about Julian? I needed to know the truth. I needed to understand what had happened, not just to clear my own name, but to find some solid ground in the shifting sands of my existence. And so I began to investigate. It started with the locked room. Marcus had always kept a study on the 3rd floor of Thornwood Hall, a private chamber that he had forbidden me to enter. He had claimed it was where he conducted his business affairs, where he reviewed accounts and wrote correspondence. I had accepted his explanation without question, grateful to have some part of the house that was my own, some space where his presence did not intrude. But now, with Marcus confined to his bed and the household in disarray, I saw an opportunity. I crept through the corridors late at night, when the servants were asleep and the house was quiet. The floorboards creaked beneath my slippered feet, and every sound seemed magnified in the darkness. The gaslight had been extinguished at midnight, as it always was, and I made my way by the light of a single candle, its flame guttering in the draughts that seemed to seep from the very walls. The key to Marcus's study hung on a ring in his dressing room, among a collection of keys that I had never before examined. I found it easily, a heavy iron key with a distinctive pattern on its bow, and I made my way to the 3rd floor with my heart pounding in my chest. The stairs wound upward through the house, past closed doors and silent portraits, past windows that showed nothing but darkness. I felt like a ghost myself, drifting through the shadows of my own home. The study was at the end of a long corridor, behind a door of dark oak that had always been kept locked. I inserted the key with trembling fingers, hearing the mechanism turn with a satisfying click. The door swung open, revealing darkness beyond. The study was smaller than I had expected, crowded with bookshelves and filing cabinets and a massive oak desk that dominated the center of the room. The air smelled of dust and old paper and something else, something chemical, something that reminded me of Julian's medical supplies. I lit a candle and began to search, my shadow leaping and dancing on the walls as I moved. What I found chilled me to the bone. There were journals, dozens of them, bound in black leather and filled with Marcus's cramped handwriting. I opened the first one and began to read, my hands trembling, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The entries dated back years, long before I had ever met my husband. They chronicled his obsession with a single subject, death, or more precisely, the conquest of death. Marcus had been consumed by the fear of his own mortality, terrified of the oblivion that awaited him. He had sought out occultists and spiritualists, had attended seances and consulted mediums. He had traveled to distant lands in search of ancient secrets, had corresponded with scientists and philosophers who shared his obsession, and he had experimented. The later journals described Marcus's attempts to find a way to cheat death. He had studied the work of galvanic researchers, those who believed that electricity could reanimate dead tissue. He had obtained corpses from the morgue through bribes and connections I could scarcely imagine, and he had subjected them to horrible procedures, seeking to spark some flicker of life in their lifeless flesh. The descriptions were clinical, detached, but they painted a picture of obsession bordering on madness. Subject 12 showed no response to the galvanic application. Increased the voltage to dangerous levels with no change. Subject expired during the procedure. Will obtain a fresher specimen for the next attempt. He had failed, again and again, but he had never given up. Each failure only drove him to more extreme measures, more dangerous experiments. He had experimented with chemicals, with electricity, with combinations of both. He had read obscure texts in languages I did not recognize, had consulted with doctors and scientists who shared his willingness to push beyond accepted boundaries. And then he had found something. A formula. A compound. The journals became increasingly cryptic, speaking of a substance that could slow the body's processes to the point where death itself could be mimicked. Marcus wrote of suspended animation, of a state between life and death where the spirit lingered, waiting to be recalled. He called it Thanatine, after the Greek god of death, and he described its effects in meticulous detail. The subject enters a state of profound unconsciousness within minutes of ingestion. The heartbeat slows to near imperceptibility. Respiration becomes so shallow as to be undetectable without specialized equipment. The body temperature drops to match the ambient environment. To all outward observation, the subject appears dead. I understood then what had happened. Marcus had not been murdered. He had been using himself as a test subject, experimenting with his own body, seeking to prove that his formula worked. He had taken the compound and entered a death-like state, and he had remained in that state until some stimulus I did not yet understand, had awakened him. But if that was true, then Julian was innocent. Julian had not poisoned Marcus. He had been treating an illness that Marcus himself had caused. I needed to find proof. I needed something that would clear Julian's name and expose the truth of what had happened. I searched the study with renewed urgency, pulling open drawers and rifling through papers. The candle burned lower, wax dripping onto my fingers, but I barely noticed the pain. I was close. I could feel it. And finally, in a hidden compartment behind a false panel in the desk, I found it. A laboratory notebook, different from the journals, filled with chemical formulas and detailed instructions. The handwriting was the same as in the journals, but more careful, more precise. This was not the record of a man's obsession. This was a scientific document, a careful accounting of experiments and results. And tucked inside the notebook, a letter. The letter was addressed to a Dr. Victor Crane, a name I did not recognize. Marcus had written it himself, dated just 3 weeks before his supposed death. In it, he described his plan in clinical detail. "My dear Victor," the letter began, "the time has come at last. After years of research and experimentation, I believe we have perfected the thanatine formula. The compound works exactly as predicted, inducing a state of suspended animation so complete that it is indistinguishable from death. I have tested it on numerous subjects with consistent results. The time has come to test it on myself." The letter continued for several pages, describing the dosage, the expected duration of the suspended state, the method by which Marcus intended to be revived. He planned to fake his own death, to enter the thanatine state and allow himself to be buried. After a predetermined period, he would awaken in his coffin and dig his way free. "I shall conquer death itself," the letter concluded, "and prove that the boundary between life and death is nothing more than a veil that science can pierce. When I emerge from my grave, I will have accomplished what no man has ever accomplished before. I will have died and been reborn." I sat in the darkness of that cramped study, the letter trembling in my hands, and I felt the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Marcus had not been murdered. He had staged his own death as an experiment. But something had gone wrong. He had awakened too early, in the chapel rather than in the grave. And in his confusion, in the disorientation of returning from the void, he had pointed at Julian. Why Julian? Perhaps because Julian was the physician who had been treating him. Perhaps because, in his addled state, Marcus had conflated the medicine Julian gave him with the compound he had been taking himself. Or perhaps there was a darker reason, one that I could not yet see. I thought of the way Marcus had looked at me in those final weeks, the cold assessment in his pale blue eyes. Had he known about my feelings for Julian? Had he guessed that I was falling in love with another man? The servants were loyal to him. Someone might have reported what they had seen, the lingering glances, the whispered conversations, the moments alone in the library or the garden. If Marcus knew, if he had been aware of my feelings for Julian, then his accusation took on a different character. It was not confusion or disorientation. It was revenge. I needed to speak with Marcus. I needed to confront him with what I had discovered and demand the truth. But the Dowager Countess still barred my way, and I knew that if I tried to force an audience, she would call the servants to restrain me. I needed another approach. I thought of Julian, languishing in a prison cell, awaiting trial for a crime he did not commit. The thought was unbearable. I had to find a way to free him, to prove his innocence. But how? My word alone would not be enough. Society had already condemned us both, had decided that we were guilty and deserving of punishment. I needed evidence that could not be ignored, testimony that could not be dismissed. And then I remembered Dr. Victor Crane, the man to whom Marcus had addressed his letter. If he existed, if he was real, then he might be able to confirm what I had discovered. He might have knowledge of Marcus's experiments, might be able to testify that the compound existed and that Marcus had been using it on himself. I searched through Marcus's papers until I found an address, a laboratory in Whitechapel, in the heart of London's most desperate slum. It was a dangerous place for a woman alone, especially a woman of my station, but I had no choice. I had to find Dr. Crane. I had to learn the truth. I left Thornwood Hall before dawn, slipping out through the servants' entrance while the household slept. I had dressed plainly in a simple gray dress and a dark cloak, and I had covered my hair with a bonnet that obscured my features. I carried a small bag containing the letter and the notebook, the evidence that might save Julian's life. The journey to London took most of the day. I traveled by train, sitting in a third-class carriage among factory workers and servants, trying to make myself invisible. The compartment smelled of coal smoke and unwashed bodies, and the wooden seats were hard and uncomfortable. But no one paid me any attention. I was just another face in the crowd, another anonymous figure moving through the great machinery of the city. Whitechapel was everything I had feared. The streets were narrow and filthy, choked with refuse and lined with crumbling buildings that seemed to lean against each other for support. The air smelled of coal smoke and rotting vegetables and something else, something organic and foul that I did not want to identify. Open sewers ran down the center of the cobblestones, their contents sluggish and dark. Children played in the muck, their faces dirty, their clothes ragged. Women stood in doorways, their eyes hollow, their bodies for sale. Men lounged on corners, their eyes following me as I passed. I kept my head down and walked quickly, clutching my bag to my chest. I had never been to such a place, had never imagined such poverty and desperation existed within the same city that housed Mayfair and Belgravia. The contrast was almost unbearable. The address led me to a building that had once been a warehouse. It stood at the end of a blind alley, its windows boarded up, its door marked with a faded sign that read, "Crane and Sons, Medical Supplies." The paint was peeling, the letters barely legible. I hesitated for a moment, my courage faltering, and then I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior was dark, lit only by a few gas lamps that flickered and hissed. The space had been converted into a laboratory, filled with glass beakers and copper tubes and strange machines that I could not identify. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of chemicals and decay that made my stomach lurch. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with jars containing specimens I did not want to examine too closely. And sitting at a workbench in the center of the room, bent over a microscope, was a man. He looked up as I entered, his face pale and thin, his eyes magnified by thick spectacles. He was older than I had expected, perhaps 60, with wispy white hair and trembling hands that spoke of age or illness or both. He did not seem surprised to see me. "Lady Ashworth," he said, his voice dry and raspy, like paper rustling in a tomb. "I wondered when you would come." I stared at him, my heart racing. "You know who I am?" "Of course. Marcus spoke of you often. He showed me your portrait once, years ago. He was quite proud of his young bride." He gestured to a chair beside the workbench, a rickety wooden thing that looked as if it might collapse at any moment. "Please, sit. We have much to discuss." I sat, my mind reeling, trying to process this strange encounter. The laboratory was cold, the air damp, and I could feel the chill seeping through my cloak. "You knew about his experiments. I helped him design them." Dr. Crane removed his spectacles and polished them on his sleeve, his movements slow and deliberate. "Marcus and I met many years ago at a lecture on galvanic resurrection. We shared an interest in the boundaries of life and death. We became colleagues, friends even, if such a word can be applied to men like us. Then you know about the compound, the substance he used to fake his death, thanatine. That was what we called it. A mixture of several rare alkaloids combined in precise proportions. It slows the metabolism to almost nothing, mimics death so perfectly that even experienced physicians cannot detect the difference. Crane's eyes grew distant, remembering. It was our greatest achievement and our greatest failure. What do you mean? The compound worked too well. We tested it on animals first, of course. Dogs, cats, eventually primates. They all survived, awakening after the prescribed period, as if from a deep sleep. But when Marcus tried it on himself, he shook his head, his spectacles catching the lamplight. Something went wrong, the dosage perhaps, or some unforeseen interaction with his physiology. He should have awakened hours after the burial, safely underground where he could dig his way free. Instead, he awakened at the funeral, in front of dozens of witnesses. I felt a chill run down my spine, deeper than the cold of the laboratory. And he pointed at Julian, at Dr. Hale. Yes. Crane's expression grew troubled, his brow furrowing. That was unexpected. When one awakens from thanatine-induced suspension, there is often confusion, disorientation. The mind struggles to reconnect with reality. Marcus may not have known what he was doing. He may have simply pointed at the nearest face, the most prominent figure in his field of vision. Or he may have done it deliberately. The thought came unbidden, dark and unwelcome. He may have wanted to blame Julian, to punish us for our love. Crane studied me for a long moment, his eyes shrewd behind his spectacles. That is possible, he said finally, his voice careful. Marcus was a proud man, a possessive man. He would not have taken kindly to discovering that his wife had formed an attachment to another. Did he know? Did he know about Julian and me? I cannot say for certain, but Marcus had ways of finding things out. He had servants who reported to him, contacts who kept him informed of everything that happened in his household. If there was anything to discover, he would have discovered it. I thought of all the stolen moments, the whispered conversations, the careful touches. Had we been observed? Had someone carried tales to Marcus, told him that his wife was falling in love with another man? The possibility filled me with dread. If Marcus knew, if he had been aware of my feelings for Julian, then his accusation took on a different character. It was not confusion or disorientation. It was revenge. I need your help, I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil within. Julian is innocent. He did not poison Marcus. He was only treating an illness that Marcus himself had caused. I need you to testify to that. I need you to tell the authorities about thanatine, about Marcus's experiments. Crane was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the workbench. The rhythm was irregular, nervous. That would be difficult, he said at last. My work has not always been strictly legal. I have obtained specimens through channels that the authorities would not approve of. If I came forward, I would be exposing myself to prosecution. An innocent man will hang if you do not. He flinched at that, his pale face growing even paler. I know, he whispered. I know. But you must understand, Lady Ashworth, I am an old man. I have dedicated my life to my research, to pushing the boundaries of what is possible. If I am arrested, if I am imprisoned, all of that will be lost. Everything I have worked for will be destroyed. I wanted to scream at him, to shake him by his thin shoulders and demand that he do the right thing. But I could see the fear in his eyes, the desperate calculation of a man who valued his work above all else. He would not help me, not willingly. Then give me proof, I said. Give me something I can use to convince the authorities. Documents, formulas, samples of the compound. Anything that will demonstrate that Marcus was using thanatine on himself. Crane hesitated, and I could see him weighing the risks. His fingers continued their nervous drumming. Finally, he nodded. There is a formula book, he said. It contains the complete synthesis of thanatine, along with notes on dosages and effects. If you could obtain it, it would prove that Marcus had access to the compound. Where is it? In his laboratory. Crane's eyes met mine, and I saw something there I had not expected. Pity. At Thornwood Hall, I felt my blood run cold. There is a laboratory at Thornwood Hall, in the cellar. Marcus had it built years ago when he first began his experiments. It is hidden, accessible only through a secret passage in the library. He never told anyone about it, not even his mother. I thought of all the times I had wandered through Thornwood Hall, believing that I knew every room, every corridor. I had explored the library countless times, had spent hours reading in its comfortable chairs, had never suspected that beneath my feet lay a hidden chamber where my husband conducted his dark experiments. How do I find it? Crane described the mechanism in detail. a particular book on a particular shelf that, when pulled, would reveal the entrance to the passage. I committed the details to memory, my mind already racing ahead to what I would find below. The book was a first edition of Paradise Lost, bound in red leather, on the third shelf from the top in the northeast corner of the library. There is something else you should know. Crane's voice had grown quiet, hesitant. His voice had grown quiet, hesitant. I waited, the silence stretching between us. Marcus was not content with merely conquering death for himself. He had greater ambitions. What do you mean? The experiments he conducted, they were not only on himself. He had subjects, people who came to him seeking cures for various ailments. He promised them health, longevity, freedom from the fear of death, and in exchange he used them as test subjects. I felt sick. Are you saying he experimented on people? On living human beings? Yes. Crane would not meet my eyes. Some of them survived. Others did not. I stumbled out of the laboratory and into the grimy streets of Whitechapel, my mind reeling with horror. My husband was a monster. The man I had married, the man whose bed I had shared for 5 years, had been conducting experiments on human beings. He had tortured and killed innocent people in pursuit of his obsession with immortality, and Julian had been blamed for his crimes. I made my way back to the train station in a daze, barely aware of the crowds around me. The streets blurred past, the faces indistinct, the sounds muffled as if I were underwater. I had thought I knew the depths of Marcus's coldness, his detachment, his indifference. But this was beyond anything I could have imagined. I knew what I had to do. I had to return to Thornwood Hall, find the hidden laboratory, and gather the evidence that would prove Julian's innocence. But I was afraid of what I would find in that cellar, what secrets my husband had buried beneath his ancestral home, and afraid, too, of what Marcus might do if he discovered that I knew the truth. The train journey back to Thornwood seemed to take forever. I sat by the window, watching the countryside roll past, fields giving way to forests, giving way to moors. The sky darkened as the train moved north, clouds gathering on the horizon, promising rain. I thought about Julian, languishing in a prison cell, awaiting trial for a crime he did not commit. I thought about his smile, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed. I thought about his hands, gentle and sure, and the way they had felt on my skin. I thought about the future we had imagined together, the life we had planned to build once I was free. Was that future still possible? Even if I proved Julian's innocence, even if I exposed Marcus's crimes, would society ever accept us? We would be notorious, the subjects of endless gossip and speculation. The woman who had loved her husband's doctor while he lay dying, the physician who had been accused of murder. No matter how thoroughly we were vindicated, there would always be those who believed the worst. But I could not think about that now. I could only focus on the task ahead. I had to clear Julian's name. I had to save him from the gallows. Everything else could wait. I arrived at Thornwood Hall as dusk was falling. The house loomed against the darkening sky, its windows glowing with lamplight, smoke curling from its chimneys. I slipped in through the servants' entrance, as I had done when I left, and made my way to my chambers without being seen. I needed to wait until the household was asleep before I could search for the hidden laboratory. The hours crawled by. I sat in my room, watching the hands of the clock inch forward, listening to the sounds of the house settling around me. I heard footsteps in the corridor, the murmur of voices, the distant clatter of dishes being cleared. The servants went about their evening routines, oblivious to my plans. And then, gradually, silence descended. The clock struck midnight. 12 long chimes that seemed to echo through the empty halls. I rose from my chair and made my way to the door, my heart pounding. The corridor beyond was dark, lit only by a single lamp at the far end. I crept forward, my slippered feet silent on the carpet, my breath shallow in my chest. The library was on the ground floor, a large, high-ceilinged chamber lined with bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. A fire had burned down to embers in the grate, casting a faint orange glow over the room. I lit a candle and began to search for the book that Crane had described. It took me nearly an hour to find it. The library was vast, and in the dim light, one leather-bound volume looked much like another. My eyes strained against the darkness, my fingers growing numb from the cold. But finally, on a shelf in the corner, I spotted a book with the distinctive red binding that Crane had mentioned. Paradise Lost. The title seemed grimly appropriate. I pulled the book, and the bookshelf swung silently inward, revealing a dark passage beyond. I hesitated at the threshold, my candle flickering in the draught. The passage stretched downward, disappearing into blackness. I could hear nothing but the sound of my own breathing, the pounding of my own heart. The air that rose from below was cold and stale, carrying a faint chemical odor that made my stomach clench. And then I stepped forward, into the darkness. The passage was narrow and steep, carved from the stone beneath the house. The walls were damp, the air cold and still. I descended carefully, one hand on the wall to steady myself, the other holding the candle aloft. The light seemed feeble against the pressing darkness, a tiny spark of warmth in an ocean of cold. At the bottom of the passage, I found a door. It was made of heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands, and it stood slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped into my husband's laboratory. The room was larger than I had expected, a long chamber with a vaulted ceiling and stone walls. Gas lamps lined the walls, their flames long since extinguished, but I found matches on a table near the door and lit them one by one, filling the space with harsh, yellowish light. What I saw made my stomach lurch. There were tables covered with scientific equipment, beakers and tubes, and strange machines that hummed with potential energy. There were shelves lined with jars containing specimens I did not want to examine too closely. Pale shapes floating in murky liquid. There were charts on the walls, anatomical drawings, diagrams of chemical processes I could not understand. And against the far wall, there were cages, metal cages, large enough to hold a human being. I approached the cages slowly, my heart in my throat. They were empty now, their doors standing open, but I could see the signs of occupation, scratches on the metal bars, stains on the floor beneath. Rust, perhaps, or something darker. People had been kept here, living people, imprisoned in this underground chamber while my husband conducted his experiments. I turned away, fighting the urge to be sick, and began to search for the formula book. I found it on a desk in the corner, a thick volume bound in black leather. Inside were page after page of meticulous notes, chemical formulas, diagrams of human bodies marked with injection sites. I flipped through the pages, my horror growing with each revelation. Marcus had been experimenting with thanatine for years. He had refined the formula, tested it on dozens of subjects. Some had died immediately. Others had entered the death-like state and never awakened. A few had survived, but their minds had been damaged, left confused and disoriented by the experience. He had documented everything with the cold precision of a scientist, noting the variables, the outcomes, the lessons learned. And then, near the end of the book, I found something that made my blood freeze. It was a list of names, a record of Marcus's test subjects, complete with dates and outcomes. Most of the names meant nothing to me. Strangers who had wandered into my husband's web and never escaped. Thomas Fletcher, laborer, deceased. Mary Collins, seamstress, catatonic state, transferred to asylum. James Worthington, clerk, successful recovery, memory loss permanent. But one name stood out, circled in red ink, marked with a notation that I did not understand. Cecilia Ashworth, Marcus's first wife. I sat down heavily in the chair beside the desk, the book trembling in my hands. Cecilia had died years before I met Marcus. I had been told that she succumbed to a fever, a tragic illness that had taken her in the prime of her life. Her portrait hung in the gallery, a beautiful woman with golden hair and sad eyes. The Dowager Countess spoke of her often, always with reverence, always with grief. The perfect first wife lost too soon. But now I knew the truth. Cecilia had not died of a fever. She had been one of Marcus's test subjects. He had experimented on his own wife. I do not know how long I sat there, staring at that terrible list. The candle burned low, guttering in its holder, and still I did not move. I was trying to comprehend the depths of Marcus's depravity, the darkness that had lurked beneath his cold exterior. He had married me not because he wanted a wife, but because he needed a new subject. He had been watching me, waiting, planning to use me as he had used Cecilia. And Julian? What did Julian know? Had he been part of Marcus's schemes, or had he been as ignorant as I? I forced myself to my feet, gathering the formula book and several other documents that seemed relevant. I had what I needed. I had proof of Marcus's experiments, evidence that thanatine existed, and that Marcus had been using it on himself and others. I could take this to the authorities, could force them to reopen the investigation. Julian would be freed. But first, I had to escape Thornwood Hall, and I had to do it without Marcus discovering what I had found. I made my way back up the passage, through the library, and into the corridor beyond. The house was dark and silent, the servants long since retired. I crept toward the front door, my bag clutched to my chest, my heart pounding. And then a voice spoke from the shadows. "Going somewhere, my dear?" I spun around, and there was Marcus. He was sitting in a chair at the foot of the stairs, still dressed in his nightclothes, a blanket draped over his shoulders. His face was pale and drawn, but his eyes were sharp, glittering with a dangerous intelligence. The lamplight caught his features, casting strange shadows across his face. "Marcus." I tried to keep my voice steady. "I thought you were confined to bed." "I was, but I have been feeling much improved." He smiled, a thin, cold expression that did not reach his eyes. "The benefits of my little compound. It accelerates the healing process quite remarkably." I edged toward the door, but he raised a hand and I stopped. "Do not think of running, Eleanor. I have had the doors locked. The servants are loyal to me, not to you. There is nowhere for you to go. I know what you have done." I lifted the formula book, holding it before me like a shield. "I found your laboratory. I found your records. I know about the experiments, about the people you killed. I know about Cecilia." Something flickered in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or anger, or something more complex, something I could not name. "Cecilia was different," he said quietly. "Cecilia was willing. She wanted to live forever, as I did. She volunteered to be the first human subject. And she died. She did not wake up." His voice cracked slightly, and for a moment I saw something human beneath the cold exterior. "I tried everything. I spent months trying to revive her, but the compound had been too strong or her constitution too weak. She slipped away, and I could not bring her back." I stared at him, seeing him clearly for the first time. He was not simply a villain, a monster driven by greed or cruelty. He was a man consumed by fear, by the terror of his own mortality. He had loved Cecilia in his way, and he had killed her in his desperate attempt to cheat death. "And then you married me." I said it flatly, without emotion. "You needed another subject." "No." He shook his head, his eyes meeting mine. "I married you because I was lonely, because I missed having a companion. I never intended to." He trailed off, his eyes sliding away from mine. "Never intended to what? To experiment on me? To use me as you used Cecilia?" He did not answer, and his silence was answer enough. "What about Julian?" I demanded. "Why did you accuse him? He was only trying to help you." Marcus's expression hardened, the vulnerability vanishing beneath a mask of cold fury. "Because I saw the way he looked at you," he said. "Because I saw the way you looked at him." I may be old, Eleanor, but I am not blind. I knew that you had fallen in love with him. I knew that you were waiting for me to die so that you could be with him, so you framed him out of jealousy, out of spite. I wanted him to suffer. The words came out in a hiss, raw with emotion. I wanted him to feel the pain of being torn away from the woman he loved, as I felt when I lost Cecilia, as I would have felt if I had lost you. I stared at him, horror and pity warring in my heart. "You are insane," I whispered. "You have let your fear of death drive you mad." "Perhaps." He rose from the chair, the blanket falling from his shoulders. He moved slowly, carefully, still weak from his ordeal. But that does not change the facts. Julian will hang for a crime he did not commit, and you will remain here at Thornwood Hall, where you belong. I backed away as he approached, my mind racing. I could not let him win. I could not let Julian die for Marcus's sins. I had to find a way to escape, to bring the evidence to the authorities, to expose the truth. And then I remembered the letter I had found in Marcus's desk, addressed to Dr. Crane. I had not shown it to the doctor, had not mentioned it during our conversation, but I had kept it, tucked into the formula book along with the other documents. "You wrote to Dr. Crane," I said. "You described your plan in detail. You told him you intended to fake your own death." Marcus stopped, his eyes narrowing. "How do you know about that?" "I found the letter. I pulled it from the book and held it up. In your own handwriting, you described the thanatine compound, the dosage, the expected duration of the suspended state. You admitted that you were going to stage your own death as an experiment." He lunged for the letter, but I stepped back, keeping it out of his reach. "Give that to me," he snarled. "No." I met his eyes, drawing on every ounce of courage I possessed. "This is proof that Julian is innocent, that you accused him falsely, that you planned the whole thing from the beginning. It proves nothing." He was panting now, his face flushed with exertion and anger. "It is the ravings of a sick man, nothing more. No court will accept it as evidence." "Perhaps not." I held my ground. "But the formula book will. The records of your experiments will. The testimony of Dr. Crane will, when I tell the authorities where to find him. You cannot silence everyone, Marcus. You cannot hide the truth forever." He stared at me, and I saw something shift in his expression. The anger faded, replaced by something that might have been respect. "You have changed, Eleanor," he said quietly. "You are not the frightened girl I married. No, I am not." I straightened my spine, feeling a strength I had not known I possessed. I am a woman who has learned what she is capable of, and I am capable of far more than you ever imagined. For a long moment, we stood facing each other, two adversaries locked in a battle that would determine the course of both our lives. The clock ticked in the hallway, measuring the seconds. The house creaked around us, settling into the night. Somewhere, a dog barked, and then Marcus sighed, and his shoulders slumped, and suddenly he looked very old and very tired. "What do you want?" he asked. "I want Julian freed. I want him cleared of all charges, publicly and completely. I want you to confess to your experiments, to take responsibility for what you have done. And I want you to let me go." He was silent for a long time. The house creaked around us, settling into the night. Somewhere a clock chimed the hour, 3 a.m, the darkest hour. "Very well," he said at last. "I will do as you ask. But know this, Eleanor, once the truth is known, there will be no place for you in society. You will be tainted by association with me. No respectable family will receive you. No decent man will marry you." I smiled, though there was little joy in it. I do not care about society. I do not care about respectability. I only care about the truth, and about the man I love. The days that followed were chaos. True to his word, Marcus confessed everything to the authorities. He described his experiments, his obsession with cheating death, his use of thanatine on himself and others. He admitted that he had falsely accused Julian, that he had pointed at him in a moment of jealous spite, wanting to destroy the man who had won his wife's heart. The scandal was immense. It consumed society, dominated every conversation, filled every newspaper. Newspapers that had previously painted me as a scarlet woman now portrayed me as a victim, a young wife trapped in a marriage to a madman. The Dowager Countess collapsed upon hearing the news and was confined to her bed, her world shattered by the revelation of her son's crimes. The servants fled Thornwood Hall, unwilling to remain in a house of horrors, and Julian was released from prison, his name cleared, his reputation restored. I went to him the day he was freed. He was standing outside the prison gates, blinking in the sunlight, looking thinner and paler than I remembered. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and there were shadows under his eyes. But when he saw me, his face lit up, and he opened his arms, and I ran to him without caring who might see. We held each other for a long time there on the street, while carriages rattled past and pedestrians stared. I pressed my face against his chest and listened to the steady beat of his heart, and I knew that I had made the right choice. Whatever came next, whatever challenges we would face, I had chosen love. I had chosen truth. I had chosen him. I thought I would never see you again, he murmured against my hair. I never doubted you. I pulled back to look at his face, memorizing every line, every shadow. Even when everyone else believed you were guilty, I knew the truth. How did you know? Because I know you. I touched his cheek gently. Because I love you. And because I refused to believe that the man who held me so tenderly could be capable of such cruelty. We left London that same day. We took a train to the coast and boarded a ship bound for the continent. We had nothing but the clothes on our backs and the small amount of money I had managed to gather. But we had each other, and that was enough. Marcus died 2 weeks later. I read about it in a foreign newspaper, a small notice buried among reports of politics and commerce. Lord Marcus Ashworth, the Earl of Thornwood, had succumbed to complications from his illness. The thanatine had damaged his body more than anyone had realized. There was no mention of his experiments, no reference to the scandal that had consumed his final days. He had simply faded away, a footnote to his own dark legacy. I felt nothing when I read the news. No grief, no satisfaction, no sense of closure. Marcus had been a part of my life for 5 years, but he had never truly been my husband. He had been a captor, a tormentor, an obstacle to be overcome. And now he was gone, and I was free. Julian and I were married in a small chapel in Italy, with only a handful of witnesses and a priest who spoke broken English. It was not the grand society wedding I had once imagined, but it was perfect. We exchanged our vows as the sun set over the Mediterranean, the sky blazing with gold and crimson and purple, and I felt a peace that I had never known before. We built a life together, Julian and I. He opened a medical practice in Florence, treating the poor and the dispossessed. I became his assistant, learning the basics of medicine, helping him care for patients who had nowhere else to turn. We had children, 2 daughters and a son, and we raised them in a house filled with love and laughter. Sometimes, late at night, I would lie awake and think about the past. I would remember the cold halls of Thornwood, the weight of my loveless marriage, the horror of discovering my husband's crimes. I would remember standing beside his coffin, watching his eyes open, seeing his finger point at the man I loved. And I would think about how far I had come, how much I had grown, how the frightened girl who had married Lord Marcus Ashworth had transformed into a woman of strength and courage. I had wept at my husband's funeral, tears of relief and forbidden hope. And the coffin had opened, and he had pointed at my lover, and for a moment, my world had collapsed around me. But I had survived. I had fought for the truth, and won. I had freed the man I loved and built a new life far from the judgment of a society that had never truly accepted me. And in the end, that was what mattered. Not the scandal, not the whispers, not the dark secrets that haunted the halls of Thornwood. What mattered was love. What mattered was truth. What mattered was the courage to stand up for both, no matter the cost. I learned something in those terrible weeks between Marcus's resurrection and Julian's release. I learned that the bonds of marriage mean nothing without love, that society's approval is worthless without self-respect, that the truth, however painful, is always preferable to lies. And I learned that I was stronger than I ever knew. The woman who wept at her husband's funeral was not the same woman who watched him die a second time, alone and unmourned. She had been reborn, transformed by adversity, tempered by suffering. She had emerged from the darkness with her head held high and her heart full of hope. That woman was me, and this is my story. The years have passed now, more than I care to count. Julian's hair has turned gray, and mine has streaks of silver. Our children are grown, with families of their own. Thornwood Hall was sold long ago, purchased by a wealthy industrialist who tore down the old house and built something modern and bright on its foundations. The hidden laboratory was destroyed, its secrets buried beneath tons of rubble. But sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I still remember. I remember the smell of lilies in the chapel, the weight of my mourning dress, the sound of screams as my husband opened his eyes. I remember the accusations and the whispers, the trial that never happened, the confession that set us free. And I remember Julian's face when he saw me outside the prison gates, the hope in his eyes, the tears on his cheeks, the way he held me as if he would never let go. That is the image I keep closest to my heart, not the horror of the coffin opening, not the darkness of my husband's laboratory, not the cold judgment of society, but love. Simple, powerful, enduring love. It saved me. It saved us both. I have no regrets. Not about falling in love with Julian. Not about investigating Marcus's secrets. Not about standing up for the truth, even when the whole world seemed aligned against us. I did what I had to do. I became who I needed to be. And if I had to do it all over again, I would not change a single thing. The world remembers Lord Marcus Ashworth as a madman, a scientist who lost his way in his obsession with cheating death. They remember the scandal, the accusations, the dramatic resurrection at his own funeral. They remember me as the faithless wife who fell in love with another man. But they do not know the whole truth. They do not know the fear I felt, trapped in a loveless marriage. They do not know the wonder I felt when Julian first took my hand. They do not know the courage it took to descend into that laboratory, to confront my husband, to demand my freedom. That truth belongs to me. It is mine to keep, mine to share, mine to pass on to my children and their children. It is the truth of a woman who was underestimated and dismissed, a woman who was seen as nothing more than a pretty face and a useful connection. A woman who discovered in the darkest moment of her life that she was capable of far more than anyone ever imagined. I wept at my husband's funeral, and the coffin opened, and he pointed at my lover, and for a moment, everything I had hoped for seemed to collapse into ruin. But I did not let it destroy me. I rose from the ashes of that disaster and built something beautiful, something lasting, something true. And if there is a lesson in my story, it is this: the darkest moment is not the end. It is only the beginning of a new chapter, a new life, a new chance to become the person you were always meant to be. I seized that chance with both hands, and I never looked back. And now, as the twilight deepens and the first stars appear in the sky, I can say with certainty, I am glad that I loved Julian, even when that love was forbidden. Glad that I searched for the truth, even when that truth was terrifying. Glad that I stood up to my husband, even when he held all the power. Glad that I chose freedom over fear, love over duty, truth over lies. I am glad for every moment of this improbable, unexpected, wonderful life, and I am grateful, beyond words, for the man who shared it with me. Julian squeezes my hand, and I turn to look at him. His eyes are still the same warm brown they always were, crinkling at the corners when he smiles. "What are you thinking about?" he asks. "Everything," I say. "Everything and nothing. The past, the future. You." He leans over and kisses my forehead, a gesture so familiar it feels like breathing. "I love you," he says simply. "I know." I rest my head on his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his heart. "I know." The sun sinks below the horizon, and the world turns purple and blue. In the garden, the grandchildren's laughter fades as they are called in for dinner. The villa grows quiet, peaceful, still, and I close my eyes and let myself be present in this moment. This perfect, ordinary, extraordinary moment. A woman in love, a woman at peace, a woman who has finally, after all these years, come home. The girl who wept at her husband's funeral is gone now, lost in the mists of memory. In her place stands someone new, someone stronger, someone braver, someone who knows, at last, what it means to be truly free. And that is the end of my story. Or perhaps more accurately, it is where my story finally found its true beginning. In love. In truth. In the courage to face the darkness and emerge into the light. This is who I am. This is who I chose to become. And I regret nothing. Not one single moment. Not one single choice. Because every moment, every choice led me here. To this place, to this person, to this life, and this life, imperfect as it may be, is mine. Mine to live, mine to cherish, mine to share with the man I love. That is my victory. That is my redemption. That is my peace. The coffin opened. My husband pointed. The world fell apart. And then, slowly, painfully, beautifully, I put it back together again. Not as it was before, but as it was always meant to be. And so, as night falls over our little villa by the sea, I whisper a prayer of thanks to whatever forces guided me through the darkness. Thank you for Julian. Thank you for courage. Thank you for love. Thank you for this life. This beautiful, improbable, precious life. I do not know what tomorrow will bring. I do not know how many more days I have left. But I know that whatever comes, I will face it as I have faced everything else. With hope, with strength, with love, and with the certain knowledge that I am exactly where I am supposed to be. I hope my story will reach others who find themselves trapped in circumstances not of their making. I hope they will find in my words some echo of their own struggles, some spark of hope for their own liberation. For if there is anything my life has taught me, it is that no prison is permanent, no darkness is eternal. No cage can hold a heart that truly wishes to be free. The woman I was when I married Marcus Ashworth was a child, really. A child playing at being an adult, pretending that duty and obligation could substitute for passion and purpose. I had been taught that a woman's role was to be decorative and compliant, to smile and nod and never question the decisions made by men on her behalf. I had been raised to believe that my value lay in my beauty and my bloodline, that my purpose was to grace a great man's home and bear his children. It took the horror of Thornwood Hall to shatter those illusions. It took the terror of watching my husband rise from his coffin to awaken the woman who had been sleeping inside me all along. And it took the love of Julian Hale to show me what I was truly capable of. I think often of Cecilia, Marcus's first wife, the woman who came before me, who loved him in ways I never could, who trusted him enough to become his test subject. I wonder what she was like in life, whether she was kind or cruel, gentle or fierce. I wonder if she knew, in those final moments before the Thanatine claimed her, that she had made a terrible mistake. I wonder if she regretted her choice, or if she went into that eternal sleep still believing in her husband's impossible dream. I will never know. Her story is lost to history, buried with the secrets of Thornwood Hall. But I carry her memory with me, a reminder of what might have been, a warning of the price of blind trust, a testament to the dangers of loving someone who loves only their own obsessions. Marcus, too, deserves some measure of my pity, though I struggle to feel it. He was a man consumed by fear, driven to terrible acts by his terror of the void that awaits us all. In another time, another place, his brilliance might have been channeled toward good. He might have been a great physician, a pioneer of medicine, a healer of the sick and suffering. Instead, he became a monster, sacrificing innocent lives on the altar of his own immortality. I do not forgive him. I cannot. The faces of his victims haunt me still, those names in his terrible ledger, those human beings reduced to data points in his mad experiments. They deserved better. They deserved justice. And though Marcus has faced whatever judgment awaits beyond the grave, their families will never know the truth of what happened to them. That weight sits heavy on my conscience, even though I was not responsible for their deaths. Perhaps that is why I tell this story now, not for my own sake, but for theirs, so that their suffering will not be entirely forgotten, so that some record will remain of the horrors that took place beneath Thornwood Hall, so that future generations might learn from the past and recognize the dangers of unchecked ambition and scientific hubris. Julian tells me I am too hard on myself. He says that I was as much a victim as any of Marcus's subjects, trapped in a marriage I never wanted, threatened by a man I had sworn to obey. He says that my courage in uncovering the truth and bringing Marcus to justice was more than most people would have managed. He says that I should be proud of what I accomplished, not burdened by guilt over what I could not prevent. Perhaps he is right. Perhaps I have spent too many years looking backward, dwelling on the darkness when I should be celebrating the light. Perhaps it is time to let go of the past and embrace the present, to focus on the blessings I have rather than the sorrows I have known. But the past has a way of holding on, even when we try to release it. It lives in our memories, shapes our choices, colors our perceptions of the world. I am who I am because of what I have experienced. The joy I feel in Julian's arms is sweeter because I know what it is to be unloved. The peace I have found in our little villa is deeper because I remember the cold emptiness of Thornwood Hall. And so I carry my past with me, not as a burden but as a gift. It has made me stronger, wiser, more compassionate. It has taught me to value what matters and discard what does not. It has shown me that even the darkest night eventually gives way to dawn. That is the lesson I leave to those who will come after me. That is the legacy I hope to pass on to my children and grandchildren. Not the scandal and the secrets, not the horror and the heartbreak, but the triumph. The victory of love over fear, of truth over lies, of courage over despair. I was a woman who wept at her husband's funeral. I am a woman who built a life worth living. And when my time comes to leave this world, I will go knowing that I made the most of the years I was given. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything. The stars are out now, brilliant points of light scattered across the velvet darkness. Julian has fallen asleep beside me, his breathing slow and peaceful. The villa is quiet, wrapped in the deep silence of the night. I could stay awake for hours, lost in memories, but sleep is calling to me too. Tomorrow will bring new joys and new challenges, new moments to treasure and new problems to solve. There will be grandchildren to chase and patients to comfort, meals to share and stories to tell. Life in all its messy, beautiful complexity. I close my eyes and let myself drift toward sleep. And as consciousness fades, I feel a smile spread across my face. Because despite everything I have been through, despite all the pain and fear and heartbreak, I am happy. Truly, deeply, completely happy. And that, in the end, is the greatest miracle of all. Not that Marcus rose from his coffin at his own funeral, not that I uncovered his terrible secrets, not that Julian was freed and vindicated, but that a woman who had given up on joy rediscovered it in the most unexpected place, in the arms of a man who saw her truly, in the courage of her own heart, in the simple, profound act of choosing to live. That is my story. That is my truth. That is my gift to you, whoever you are, wherever you are, whatever darkness you may be facing. Hold on. Keep fighting. Never give up. Because the coffin opens eventually, for all of us, and what happens next is up to you. Choose wisely. Choose bravely. Choose love. Always, always choose love. And when you do, you will find what I found in the ruins of my broken life. Not just survival, not just freedom, but joy. Real, lasting, unshakable joy. The kind that carries you through the darkest nights. The kind that makes every sunrise feel like a gift. The kind that transforms everything it touches. That is what I found with Julian. That is what I have carried with me through all the years since Thornwood Hall. That is what I will carry with me into whatever comes next. Joy. Pure and simple and utterly, completely mine. The coffin opened, and my husband pointed at my lover, and I found joy anyway. That is the final truth of my story. That is the message I leave behind. That is the light I offer to anyone who finds themselves lost in the dark. Joy is possible. Even after everything, especially after everything. Never forget that. Never stop believing it. Never let anyone convince you otherwise. The darkest moment is not the end. It is only the beginning. And the beginning is where everything beautiful starts. Good night, whoever you are. Sleep well. And wake tomorrow, ready to begin again. The world is waiting. Your story is waiting. Your joy is waiting. All you have to do is reach for it. All you have to do is choose. I chose. And look what happened. Now it is your turn. Go, live, love, be free, and know that somewhere, in a villa by the sea, an old woman is smiling. Because she knows the truth. And the truth is this: it was worth it. Every moment of pain, every second of fear, every tear I shed at that terrible funeral, it was all worth it. Because it led me here, to this moment, to this peace, to this joy, and I would not trade a single moment of it, not for anything, not for anyone, not for all the world. This is my life. This is my story. This is my truth, and it is beautiful. Just as yours will be. Just as everyone's can be. If only we have the courage to claim it. The courage to fight for it. The courage to believe we deserve it. I believe you do. I believe everyone does. And that belief, more than anything else, is what I want to leave behind. The belief that joy is possible. The belief that love conquers all. The belief that the darkest night always gives way to dawn. Hold on to that belief. Let it guide you through the darkness. Let it carry you toward the light. And when you finally emerge, blinking in the brightness of a new day, remember this story. Remember the woman who wept at her husband's funeral. Remember how the coffin opened. Remember how she fought. Remember how she won. And know that if she could do it, so can you. So can anyone. The power is within you. It has always been within you. All you have to do is find it. All you have to do is use it. All you have to do is believe. And then anything is possible. Anything at all. Even joy. Especially joy. That is my final word. That is my final gift. That is the end of my story. And the beginning of yours. Go write it. Make it beautiful. Make it true. Make it yours. And when you reach the end, look back and smile. Because you will know, as I know now, that it was all worth it. Every single moment, every single choice, every single tear, worth it. For the joy that comes after, for the love that makes it all matter, for the life that waits on the other side of fear. That is what I found. That is what I wish for you. That is the blessing I send out into the world as I close my eyes and surrender to sleep. May you find your Julian. May you escape your Thornwood. May you discover the strength you never knew you had. and may your story, like mine, end in joy. Sweet dreams, dear reader. The dawn is coming, and it will be beautiful. I promise.